All right. Welcome one last time for the last talk of KCD Austria in Hall 6. For this time, we have Arthur Berezin. I hope I pronounced it correctly, somewhat correctly.
You did.
From Israel. He's one of the co-founders from Cloud Native Tel Aviv. He's the CEO and co-founder of Stage Central, and he's going to give us some insights into 4 common pitfalls when adopting Backstage. One more thing before we can start. We have a surprise event afterwards, so please just don't leave after the talk. Go to Hall 4. We have a surprise there, and we have some very short closing ceremony.
All right. Hello and good afternoon, KCD Austria. So today I'm going to talk about Backstage, surprisingly. I'm Arthur Berezin, founder and CEO of a company called Stage Central. We focus on Backstage. And today I'm going to start with 3 stories. So who here is from Austria? Awesome. So you'll probably be able to help me figuring out who's this guy. I'm hearing, what's his name? Schwarzenegger, that's right. So what's amazing, to me at least, about his story is that, this young kid growing up somewhere in middle of Austria, right, having this nice dream, this vision of being, this bodybuilder after seeing a bodybuilder picture in a magazine, right? And from that becoming into Mr. Olympia 7 times. Just think about it. Think about this amazing story. And after he becoming Mr. Olympia, he has this nice little dream of, he's obviously in California, seeing a lot of actors in Hollywood. He has this nice little dream of becoming a Hollywood action hero, not just, an actor or a celebrity, but becoming an actual, action hero. 10 years later, it took him some time, but he was able to achieve that. And after that, he became the governor of California. So to me, this story is super inspiring. The second story I'm going to share today, you're probably aware of this story too, right? Are you familiar with this nice little beverage? All right. So I'm going to take some time. Prost. So what's amazing to me from this story of Red Bull, obviously taking this nice little Thai drink into a major energy drink empire, and not just making it into an energy drink empire, turning a Formula 1 team out of it. Not just Formula 1 team, a Formula 1 team that was able to win 6 times the world championship. Right? This story is freaking crazy, right? The third story I'm going to share today is the story of Backstage. And you might be asking, what's the analogy here, right? What are the similar storylines? So not many know that Backstage essentially started as this nice little documentation project within Spotify, right? Basically, engineers were trying to document their code. Obviously, engineers love living within their code, and they love writing their documentation as part of their code line. So basically, Backstage started within Spotify as this project to visualize the documentation that we're creating internally. Sometime later, obviously that saw a lot of success within Spotify. Spotify extended the team behind the project, and added more functionality and capabilities, basically enabling it not only to see documentation, but also to be able to see other platforms that Spotify were using within the company. They saw the success within the company and realized, hey, there's this need for such a product elsewhere, right? We are seeing other organizations developing similar stuff. Why not open source it and let others just use our stuff? So it took them about a week to prepare their internal project and turn it into a more of a open source ready project. They contributed that to the CNCF, and sometime later, it became this widely popular project that's being adopted by thousands of organizations, like more than 1,000 adopters right now that are publicly announced, and 25,000 stars, like major project, and widely adopted project. So what is Backstage? So Backstage essentially is an IDP, and when I say IDP, this term IDP sort of became an overloaded term, and I don't mean identity provider, right? What I mean is internal developer portal, and not in the Rick and Morty sense portal, right? But in a sense that basically it's a portal that allows us to see in terms of what's going on within the organization, and basically to manage the cloud resources within the organization. But it also stands for internal developer platform, right? Basically, the platforms that we as platform engineers are building and creating within the organizations that we work with. And this is essentially part of this whole platform engineering trend, right? So what is platform engineering? So platform engineering is essentially like this whole new trend that just recently started. We're starting, to sort of formalize and understand what this actually means. Obviously, as with any buzzword and with any trend, there are some differences of opinions of what it actually means. And luckily for us, we are starting to see a lot of convergence around what platform engineering actually is. So the first part about platform engineering is essentially productization of whatever artifacts the DevOps folks are creating, right? We as DevOps, we create Terraform modules, we create Helm charts, we create Kubernetes configurations, we integrate CI pipelines, we create continuous delivery pipelines, we do automation on top of cloud providers, right? We produce a lot of artifacts that we as DevOps like to use, right? But if you actually sit down with a developer, right? Developers are not keen on going to the AWS console, right? They're not really want to do Terraform init or Terraform apply, right? This is not natural to developers, and obviously we are sort of becoming these YAML engineers, and developers are not really, they don't really love being YAML engineers. That's not exactly their domain. So the whole point of productization of DevOps is basically, taking all these artifacts that DevOps folks are creating and basically creating workflows and journeys around them and productize them in order for developers to more easily consume them, right? So if I'm a developer and I would like to introduce a new service in my organization, I shouldn't have to go through this path of DevOps tools that I don't feel comfortable with. Rather, I should take a path that would be much easier for me as a developer to adopt, right? So the first part of that is basically productize the DevOps tool sets that we create. The second part of that is self-service, right? I shouldn't have to talk to my DevOps team to create an S3 bucket for me, right? I should just have a button or a UI or a CLI or whatever interface I decide that's comfortable for my developer. And what's interesting is that each organization is a little bit different. So if you go to one organization, probably developers would say, hey, we prefer having an API endpoint that would allow us create some set of resources or resources with a specific set of configurations. That's relevant, obviously, for us, right? It's not just default setup that would come from the cloud provider. So the second part of that is essentially enabling self-service, productizing the DevOps artifacts, and then enabling them as a self-service, in a self-service manner for developers. And usually that's done through a software catalog, right? So basically, what does that mean? That I'm, as a developer, I would like to see, obviously, the work that I'm doing on the services I'm responsible for, but I would also like to have the ability to look into resources of other teams, right? To basically figure out what other teams are doing, to understand the relationships of my team's work and other teams' work, right? For example, I'm using an API like part of my service. I'm using an API from an external service. I should be able to quickly see this relationship. And if there's a new personnel jumping on board, joining my team, I should just give him access to the architecture of the environment, and basically he should be able to figure out very quickly the relationships of the platform and everything that's going on, right? So that's the third part, the service catalog. And obviously, once I have visibility into that, I should be able to perform self-service operations of the artifacts that the platform team and the DevOps folks are creating. So we have this kind of architecture where we have, like at the bottom part, we have the infrastructure that we just use, right? AWS, Amazon, GitLab, GitHub, Argo CD, whatever toolset that we use. On top of them, we provide our own, or we create the configurations and the customizations that are relevant to us, to our organization, to our specific use case, right? So this is the platform that we create, and that could be like using Ansible, Terraform, CloudFormation, whatever automation tools we might use in our tool stack that would make sense for our use case. And then on top of that, we have this portal, right, which essentially allows visibility and control to everyone, right? So you don't have this mental toil of learning yet another technology, yet another tool, in order to consume the platform that the platform team is creating, right? So essentially, like the portal is this self-service UI or interface that allows us to interact with the platform. Luckily, that's exactly what Backstage is doing. So Backstage has a software catalog, right? It essentially allows you to, like in a very simple way, describe the services that you have within the organization, and describe the relationships between the various services, components, API endpoints that we have as part of our software, right? We basically have like a bunch of software, and now we have a very simple way of visualizing that and describing the relationship of all the components and all the elements that creates the software. Now, the second very critical part of that is that this information within the catalog, it's not something static, right? It's not something that's, I just defined at a certain point in time, and that's pretty much it. A year has gone by, and then nothing changed, right? Software is dynamic. Software is alive, right? Software constantly changes. So in order to articulate these changes, basically Backstage has this notion of plugins, right? Basically, you can integrate various systems, platform systems, and show the relevant information, information within the software catalog with the right context, right? So I'm basically seeing an item within the catalog. I'm in the context of this specific service, and I can showcase, the relevant Kubernetes pods. I can showcase the relevant latest builds that are specific for that service. So that's the second part there, which is the platform integrations enabled via plugins. The third part is the self-service templating, right? So developers should be able to create new services, not creating tickets for platform or for IT, for DevOps. Hey, I would like to create a new GitHub repository. Please do that for me, right? In the best practice that you have that includes Redis and Mongo, right? That's bananas these days, right? You don't want to create a ticket for someone. You want to have a button that basically creates this new software component based on a template that is the golden path for my specific organization, right? So that's the third part, which is implemented by something called the scaffolder within Backstage, and obviously Backstage has this component where it started, which is documentation as code, right? I can basically document my software, and then Backstage connects to all the repositories that create these documents, and can very easily visualize them in the context of the specific service, right? So as a newcomer to an organization, I can just have this access to this portal. I see, hey, I see this map of relationships. I can just click on a specific component, specific service, specific API endpoint, and immediately within the context of that specific component, I can see obviously all the information coming from the platform components and the documentation for that specific part. So think of the cognitive load this reduces to newcomers and to developers that are joining the organization, or just to the daily operations, right? If you ever looked at a screen of a developer, you would probably see like 50 tabs or something open, and that's just their daily lives, right? They have tons of systems they need to keep track of in the context of whatever they're doing. So basically, Backstage reduces this cognitive toil, this cognitive load for developers, because everything is one place, and they're always showing that in the specific context that they're working on. And of course, Backstage also has this nice little web UI, right? It sort of prevents us the need of developing it ourselves, much easier to navigate through the various systems. So all you have to do is just go to this nice little website, Backstage.io, you click on download, and you're ready to go. Are you excited? Yeah. All right. So that brings us to the pitfalls of Backstage. Obviously, we've been speaking to quite a few Backstage implementation owners, and we've come to realize that there are certain set of common pitfalls around Backstage that makes it a little bit harder than just going to a website, right? So basically, the first one is, if you want it, if I got you convinced and sold that Backstage is awesome, it is, okay? You basically have to build it. So when I showed you this nice little screenshot of the website, I kind of lied, just a little bit. Because Backstage essentially is a platform, but it's not just a platform, it's a framework. And Backstage is a software development framework using TypeScript in order for building new developer portals, right? So it's not something you just would simply just helm install and you're done. Rather, if you go to the documentation, if you actually click through the documentation, you would be able to see that when you create a new instance of Backstage, in fact, what you're doing is that you're creating a new TypeScript application. Now, what does it actually mean to create a new TypeScript application? Us as production people, we probably know that, right? We own it, right? And if we own it, there's a bunch of stuff we need to do in order to actually run it in production. So Backstage itself, when you do this nice little npx command that creates this new TypeScript application, essentially it brings you two components, right? You have the front end, which is implemented in React.js, obviously in TypeScript, and also it brings you the backend of Backstage, which is also implemented in TypeScript. And by default, it installs it using SQLite. Obviously, no one uses SQLite in production, so you have to figure out how to stand up your own database or use RDS or whatever to create your own Postgres database. Now, the backend usually is the component that's responsible for interacting with external services. So if you remember earlier when I mentioned that you basically integrate your developer portal with your existing platform, right? This kind of integration, this is the kind of integration that I meant, right? So basically the backend interacting with the various components, with GitHub, with Kubernetes, Jenkins, Argo CD, or whatnot that you're using as part of your platform in order to bring that information to the front end. So three components or three parts that are kind of important to keep in mind here. The first one is the app config YAML. Again, we are YAML engineers, so we love YAML. So the app config essentially allows you to configure the behavior of Backstage. Catalog info allows you to document the services or the services that should be presented within the catalog. And they can either be as part of Backstage itself, or you can just point it to various GitHub repositories in order for Backstage to scan the repositories and show the catalog information from these repositories. And the third one is the folder for the plugins. Now, when we containerize stuff, usually within the container, stuff are stateless, right? So this brings us to challenge number one. So now we need to figure out like a way of running this whole thing in production, and obviously this requires us, again, taking ownership of the application that we are creating, and this requires us having TypeScript skill set, and essentially like most of the organization we've been talking to, and that's about like 70 or something, like a number of 70 organizations that we've talked to, like most of them actually created dedicated IDP, dedicated Backstage, dedicated team that's responsible and owns Backstage, which has internal TypeScript skill sets. So obviously you have to have TypeScript skill set, you have to have a team that's dedicated for IDP. But today I would like to suggest a little simpler way, which is using Docker, right? So one of the challenges here is that basically Docker is stateless, but we do want to have some parts that are stateful. So what we did there is essentially, let's just run this nice little command, hoping it would not break. All right, so if you notice the message here, basically what we did here as part of our own Docker image is we embedded a set of mechanisms that allows us to persist the various parts that should be persistent within Backstage. Right, so basically when you run the container, basically internally we have an entry point that presets the Backstage configuration, and you can also mount a volume to it. So if you look at the log messages here, we basically are looking for a specific folder, and once we detect that this folder exists, we can extract the source code and build Backstage within it, and that allows us to run it, but also to modify the source code. I'm going to touch on that in a minute, why that part is important, and to keep that persistent. Okay, so I've run this Docker image, no specific configuration. In this case, I did not mount a volume, so obviously it identified there's no persistent storage here. All right, and if you are on top of your JavaScript stack, so you'll be able to see that we have here two processes, one for the backend, another one for the front end. And at this point, I should be able to go to my localhost 7007, and voila, one Docker run, and I have Backstage running. All right. So what do we have here within Backstage? So the first page, the home page, basically is my catalog of components. I can basically have all the components within my organization, I can have them listed here. So just a list of components, obviously it's not that interesting, but what's cool about Backstage is that you have a detailed view of the component itself, the relationship within other components. But the more interesting part here is that you basically can integrate external systems as tabs shown in the context of this specific service, right? So for example, I have here example website. This is like the default catalog for when you install Backstage. You can integrate your own CI system here, right? So this tab would basically show the latest builds of this specific component. Now think of a developer and developer's workflow, right? So I'm committing code. I have to go to my CI system, and then something goes wrong. I have to go to my logs system, and then like it behaves weirdly, so I have to go to my monitoring system to get the latest metrics or whatever. And like I have like a bunch of systems I have to interact with daily just to figure out what's going on. So instead of having like all these tabs open and like trying to figure out, hey, where do I live that's tab that's specific, that's showing information from a specific service, instead of having that, right, I have everything here in the same context of the service and making it very easy to navigate through. All right, so that's that. The next part is the productization part. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we are platform folks, we are DevOps folks. We know what it means to own a service, right? So obviously, once we have this nice little TypeScript project, that's just the very beginning. We have to figure out Docker files, we have to figure out the Docker images, where to store them, how to store them, the security of them, all the dependencies. Again, this is TypeScript or JavaScript project. If you've ever looked into what JavaScript looks like there are a million dependencies that you need to take care of. Every single build, one of these dependencies might break. They do break from time to time. Again, super painful to experience. So our hope is that once we Dockerize everything and make things a little bit more stable for regular users to use, hopefully that should sort of make things simpler. Now, obviously, we run things in production on Kubernetes. Again, we are at KCD. So that means we have to figure out the YAML configurations for everything. We have to figure out Helm deployment, might be Argo CD application or application set, right? We want to bring the database with this application when we create it, right? So we have to either take ownership of that or use a managed service for that. And we have to think of availability, resilience, scale, and like gazillion other things. I'm going to skip the gazillion other things. I'm going to talk a little bit about upgrades. So again, this is a TypeScript application. Now imagine you've implemented your own part. What does it mean to upgrade the application? So now I have to like manage my own fork. And if there are conflicting changes between my code and code that's coming from a new version, like should I do code review for every upgrade? If that's 10 lines of code, all right, not too much of a fuss. But if this is like a 2-year or 3-year in project, like I have a lot of code by now, right? So I need to maintain and manage that. So that's also super challenging over time. Yeah, so part of the things that we do to sort of mitigate this sort of stressful situation is we have this Helm chart that basically has this similar mechanism that I showed earlier with the Docker image, right? And once you install the Helm chart, part of the Helm chart, basically we have a few parts here. So when you run it, let's just see that it is running. And you see the command here basically uses an ingress server. Again, this is like a local Minikube setup, so just make sure that networking is not an issue here. So I have here Backstage running as part of a Minikube and accessible via the ingress rule. So what's baked in within the Helm chart is a few things. So first of all, the Helm chart also supports natively ingress and load balancer, right? So you don't have to figure out how to create the service, how to connect them. There's a backend and front end of Backstage that you need to take care of networking for that. And the second part is the database. That's also baked in. You can either enable it or disable it. Once you enable it, all the Backstage configurations are already preset. Or you can use just an RDS and just provide a connection string, which is perfectly fine. And the third part is the persistent volume, right? So basically, I have this mechanism that allows me to store the data within the persistent volume. Not too interesting, but what's cool about it is that once you have both the source code and the build within the volume, you can always add your own customizations. You can have everything within the container, containerized, running within Kubernetes, at scale, at the configuration that makes sense for your setup. But you can also do dynamic builds of the code changes that you introduce. So if you can see here, running this on Kubernetes, I have, in this case, again, let's do like Helm list. So you can see I have this Helm chart installed. And this Helm chart brings me, it brings me, in this case, again, super simple deployment setup. I have Postgres and the Backstage pod running, and that's running with the persistent volumes. Again, persistent volume for the database, and another persistent volume for Backstage itself that stores both the source code of Backstage, allowing you to make customizations, and also the resulting build of the process that allowing you to like reboots, restarts, and all the magic that we enjoy within Kubernetes. All right, so that's the Helm chart. Thirdly, the third lesson learned that we've got that essentially super painful for newcomers is plugins. So like we're used to this notion of plugins where we can install a plugin as if we install an app on our phone, right? Again, if you're working if you ever worked with WordPress, for example, right? You have this nice little UI page. You just choose a plugin, you click on install, or you just run one command, install, and you're ready to go. So unfortunately, with Backstage, that's not exactly the case. So you have like a huge set of, or large set, and I wouldn't say huge, but a large set of plugins that are available and developed by the community. So like I have like basically plugin for like most of what you could think of. There are more than 100 plugins available in the plugin catalog for Backstage. But in order to enable it and start working with the plugin, even with the most basic one, which is Kubernetes, right? All we want to do is just see pods in the context of our service, like super simple requirement. What did I ask, right? So in order to make that work, right? If you look at the documentation, you basically can see that you actually need to edit TypeScript code, and you need to import the Kubernetes plugin within TypeScript, add the specific UI elements that implement that specific plugin, rebuild the whole thing, push it to production through the pipeline, and you're sort of ready to go, right? So this is like for newcomers that just want to evaluate Backstage, super complex process. So when you plan Backstage projects, keep that in mind. And the last part, which is in fact not the technical part, but the most important part, which is adoption. So like a lot of users that we talk to struggle with adoption, right? Because again, like we as engineers, we take such projects in engineering angle, right? How do we implement that? How do we build it? How do we integrate that, right? But again, we are productizing the platform, right? And in order to productize the platform, we need to sort of think as product managers where we have customers and users which are the developers of the organization, right? So we need to have this sort of developer experience role, developer experience product manager role that's responsible for interacting with the developers, making sure that what we're building actually makes sense for them, right? We need to collect, like this person or this team needs to record the journeys the developers are having today, right? Like what are their screens? What are their journeys? Like what commands do they do? What systems do they use? Like what's the flow, right, that they're using? And need to ensure that this flow is implemented within the platform, within the portal, in a way that makes sense for them, right? Otherwise, they would just not use that because that would be like more complex than just use the existing systems that they have today. The third part there is integrated R&D workflows, meaning, again, think of integrating these things into their existing lives, right? Think of integrating it within their ID, like having a tab within VS Code, having a link that opens, like once they do a commit, for example, having a link that shows them the relevant service for Backstage, integrating that with Slack, with Teams, sending an email notifications with a link to Backstage. Like think of the ways that this platform is integrated within their daily lives. Obviously, once we've done that, that's not enough. We need to actually understand that they are using that and continue using it. So we need to collect usage and engagement metrics, right? See, do they log in? Do they log out? Do they what tabs do they use? What tabs do they never use, right? Why is it even there if they never use it, right? So we need to have someone responsible for that. And this whole loop is basically a continuous feedback loop, right? So it's not that we've done this whole integration project for 1 or 2 months and we're ready to go. Rather, this whole thing is continuous because, again, our R&D organization is basically a living organism, right? It constantly changes, constantly evolves, and we need to make sure that this tool basically follows the patterns of the teams that we are working with. So, yeah, the Steve Ballmer approach of just jumping adoption, Backstage, it does not work, and usually it ends up with this. All right, so to summarize, again, adopting Backstage can be painful, but it also can be awesome. It can be simpler. It should be simpler than it is today. We are, trying to contribute to the open source community to make this process much simpler. So when you adopt when you think of adopting Backstage, again, think of the build process, think of the productization, like how do I make this a production-grade software. Think of plugins, like which plugins do I use, which community plugins are enough, right? Some plugins are awesome, but they're just they're a little bit superficial or not enriched enough to our use cases. And think of adoption, which is again, just speaking to people here, have heard this multiple times that adoption of Backstage is painful. And that's pretty much it. So we have, if you like my Morty t-shirt, we have a raffle of t-shirts. So make sure to scan and you might win a t-shirt as well. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot. That's been the last talk on stage 6 for today and for KCD Austria 2023, but we're not done yet. First of which, we heard a lot of Backstage. Does anybody have questions regarding the life of Arnold Schwarzenegger? Questions about Backstage, maybe? 3, 2,
I would have a question.
Yes.
So we are using Backstage as well, and we customized our instance a lot. So we have lots of plugins, we have custom entity pages, custom pages for groups, and so on. How would you actually do that with the Helm chart you showed?
Yeah, so basically the Helm chart has persistent volume, and all the customizations are stored within the volume, right? So you can make changes to the code, and they are persistent within that volume. But if you already have the CI process in place, someone already invested into building that, that's perfectly fine as well.
Thank you.
Right? The reason for doing this is basically to help you get started much quicker. Instead of you figuring out that yourself, right, you have that sort of out-of-the-box ready to go, but dynamically enough that you can just enrich it as you go.
Nice, thank you.
Cool. All right, thank you so much.
So before anybody leaves now, we're not done yet with KCD Austria 2023. There is a surprise event at 4 p.m. Until then, I was told there's still free cake in the basement, or in the base floor. Maybe also in the basement. But we have coffee, we have some drinks left, and make sure to be at Hall 4 at 4 p.m. Thanks.
All right.